EQs and stuff, that should kind of color your decision on, say, how things are in your room being perceived to how they're actually happening in audio here with the spectrum. And say, like, if you had a lot of sub and stuff and still it wasn't coming through, you can go and check your phase relationships between each sub-based thing, like kick and sub and maybe your main bass or something, and see how those interact with each other, because that can affect editing, that can affect EQ, as well as like some type of plugin potentially. So here's a plugin that if you don't have like perfect phase, in your DAW, like this is a good tool for that. And like, I don't personally have a use for this, so I haven't invested into this in a while. Like, I have the Surfer EQ, which is really cool. But there's this plugin called Auto Align. And so what that does is it reads any of the detected signals and then offsets it in samples. So this is really cool because Surfer EQ is really, really cool. Yeah, and to Zero Tep's point as well, mixing quietly will definitely affect how you mix over time. Because back to this, and the threshold of pain. Those aren't direct enough. There's a lot of like lists here. Should be able to get a really clean one. It's the same wiki. Anyways, I'll go and check that out in a second here. But the rule of thumb is always to mix, if you're going to professionally mix, is 87 dB. $87 dB is a good middle ground because it's kind of like a little bit less than 90, which 90 is pretty loud. For me, when I'm trying to get hyped, I listen at 90, and you can get a decibel meter on your phone for free. There's a bunch of them. And or you can get a real one. Depends on what you want to do. So that will definitely affect how you perceive sound in a space with phase, how you perceive your EQ, and compression and saturation decisions later on during the process, which definitely is crucial. Like, if you're trying to get your shit loud, like really loud, like say like neg 3 lefts loud, like Moody Good loud, you got to understand that stuff, because Moody Good is just definitely just squashing everything together. He's not really joking when he says he just puts sausage fattener and OTT and he's good to go. But a lot of people debate that. Oh, it's just subtractive EQ. Subtractive EQ. What's that mean? That means that he's subtracting frequencies from other parts of the sounds that don't complement each other. They go out of phase. So what you want is everything to happen at the same time, to be in phase. So say, step away from Moody Good, what does Moody Good kind of like capture, and like, why is it so loud and why does it hit so hard? It's because there are minimal things happening in the mix. There are about 4 to 5 things happening. And just to, Stosie's point there, just make a conscious decision about that. But to kind of like really drive the point home about phase and things happening all at once. We talked about in like the sampling class the other day about phrasing and all that stuff, and how many things should be happening or where they should be happening. And I want to get into like an arrangement kind of course too, where I kind of like put that into practice. and kind of show you like how I do that with a lot of my tracks and stuff, or how I would approach like a house, drum and bass, you know, because I approach all those tunes. And when I sound design and do stuff, it leads to a different outcome. Like I don't limit my, my, I guess, art process or my workflow by saying I'm making this type of track today. I'm just sitting down and making sounds, and I'm like, oh, it would be dope for this. And then I go and do that. So it's like, that's really my process. And I feel like that's really the process with a lot of people who are very original, just because they're not really trying to subscribe with something they're being told by their own taste to do. Yeah, so you really got to manage that. You got to manage your own taste and manage how you're allowing yourself to express that art and stuff like that. So when I approach coalescing all those sounds together, I actually limit the amount of things happening. I cut down because I want the thing that I spent a lot of time on to really be showcased. So that means there's kick, snare, hi-hats, which support my bass rhythms most of the time. So bass rhythm and hi-hat sync as one part. And when those things get taken out, I put in something else that might be a fill or just to showcase like a new sound or another sound. So because of that, it allows me to really process each of those sounds to their like full potential and really allow them to shine in the mix just by themselves. And that makes my final master hit super hard. And I learned this just because, you know, trial and error, and then also just really trying to assimilate the, you know, the deeper parts of like people I admire, which is like, how are they getting to this result as opposed to, I just want to get their result, you know? Because that other thought process limits me, and I'm all about eliminating things that limit me at all points of contact. All right, so that means you need to have things aligning in phase, not only in editing in time, but also in processing in your frequency range. Like if you split things out into bands and you start to introduce phase problems, which means that the start position of the left and right channel are now being offset by, you know, some type of, I guess, you know, imperfection in its own quality, but also a function of you splitting it out into bands manually. So multi-band compressors and saturators are multi-band compressors and saturators because they're dialed for phase. So when you go and start to do that, say in an audio effects track with a bunch of multi-bands, you're going to introduce phase problems because there's no I guess delay compensation per chain in an audio effects track yet. So you can do a lot of stuff like that for sound design purposes, but you will introduce phase problems, which means that, say if you split a band, you know, with a multi-band in an audio effects track, and I think I actually have a little default of that. Band split with macro. Okay, so like if you do something like this, because I actually use this for a lot of different like effects, and so I'll drop a plugin on here, you know, just to kind of like introduce some weird stuff, and then that'll add a ton of like latency because it's not going to be compensated for, but that can be really cool, you know, if you're doing something sound design wise. That phase can be cool. So, you know, I'm consciously making that decision here. But if I was doing some type of master processing or bus processing for like a drum group, I would not do this because I do not want to have any phase problems between my low mid range and my sub range, because that destroys your low mids on your master. And definitely need to have that actual, you know, polished piece of art that gets its final polish in the master phase. And that's really what you want. If you're relying on things to be fixed in the master, then you're relying on the wrong thing. not just like as a person, you know, it's like any mastering engineer that has these problems to work with cannot execute what you want, which is that shit to be loud. Yes, Mary, that creates phasing. So to Seto's point as well, you could phase correct, and that's where things like auto align can help, where you can actually do this for anything, not just random other things. So when do I use this in EDM, besides like, you know, live sound? Because this is to get the power of Pro Tools and any DAW for phase alignment, because Pro Tools allows you to offset things in time by sample amounts, and that's not what you can do here. It's not what you can do in a lot of other DAWs. So that's a big thing. And what's crazy though is that this kind of like ties into a lot of this stuff. So when you're talking about phase, you're also talking about signal flow, talking about music theory, you're also talking about perceiving audio. Because when phase is out of line, it's probably a result of some note offsetting with each other, some part of your signal flow that's fucked up, or your mix as a whole is clashing. So things like decibel, dB, SPL, dBu, these are all different mediums of measuring decibel, the audio loudness unit. So this is what you're going to be seeing in everything inside of a DAW with negative values pretty much, because in a DAW you have everything below 0, nothing above 0, or else you're clipping. dB/SPL is how you measure things in a space, sound pressure level. And dBu is another unit of measurement for digital decibel reading. But it's a little bit more scaled, so you can get kind of a finer resolution out of it. And then LUFS or RMS, should really include RMS in there. This gives you an average level, like kind of like power level reading. So when I'm talking about neg 1.5 LUFS for like a Moody Good track, that's like everything is happening at once and then being squashed up into 0. So what does that mean? Neg 1.5 LUFS, that means the dynamic range between the loudest and the quietest point, there is only 1.5 dB of change below 0. So when Spotify or iTunes limits your tracks with normalization, which normalization will kind of limit the LUFS reading or RMS signal as opposed to the dB or peak level, and just turn down your track entirely if it's too loud. So your track will actually be quieter than something that's mixed, you know, without, I was about to say well, but it's not that it's bad mixing, it's just that's hyper mixing. It's actually a different thing. It's a different thing than mixing something that's a little bit more like, I say, down tempo, lo-fi, all that other stuff, you know. So having nice peaks in your waveform is a luxury of things that don't need to be dropped in a DJ set by some kind of main stage DJ that needs that kind of like super processed, hyper compressed thing. All right, so, you know, we really need to understand phase. Phase is going to be one of the biggest things, you know, to make sure that our, you know, low mid range and our sub range is really popping. Because when we perceive audio, back to the Fletcher-Munson curve, this is the normal range. So we perceive sub range, you know, pretty loud. But also, the mid-range has a scoop. So, you know, what does that mean? We need to actually dial our mix in to be flat, you know? So, we need to understand that our ears do this. They color our perception. So we might push things up here. We might pull back things up here or even push them more. But ultimately, we're going to leave mid-range scooped. So what's that mean? Scooped means that there is a dip. So there's a scoop out at the mid-range. So understanding how this works should lead to you understanding how it should work as a whole, where you can actually, you know, compensate your mix. And like when I like, you know, kind of, I mean, just have taught this in the past and like have shown people how to master or have done all this stuff, it's really just like, hey dude, do you understand how to get your mids to pop? And then once the mids pop, then all of a sudden, you know, everything is happening in time, back to the audio shit, you know, and now you can really hear things loud. And that's why I recommended that Bob Katz book, because Bob Katz like really paints it well. And what he does is he also brings in the examples of hundreds of engineers, like professional engineers, not like, so that's like Bob Katz Mastering Audiobook. Definitely cop that, just because it literally, you know, will create this whole different perception of audio. And this is what like demystified it for me. That book did that for me, just reading it by myself. And so like after that, you know, I was able to get things really loud. And it's because when the mids are locked with the lows and the highs, meaning you have a flat frequency response, it'll actually create this kind of pseudo acoustic response for us. Pseudo meaning fake, that it's not actually louder, but it seems louder, because we perceive things with that dip. So when that dip is filled and is put through a system that EQs anything, because the smile EQ is what I'm talking about, where it's like you scoop the mids, and that's what they call the smile EQ, is that you're scooping out the mids and kind of like clearing out that thing that, you know, is really making the mix hit hard, because then it's going to be re-scooped when it's put into any other system. So, you know, that is going to be a huge thing. That's going to affect how we EQ, how we compress, what we're going to introduce when we talk about delays and spectral effects and stuff like that. You know, so I definitely want to like make that like a big point, you know, to like really start there. Understand how phase affects the perception of audio and how that is really key. Okay, so I'm going to kind of talk about a couple more things and then we're going to kind of jump into this. All right, so computer optimization is really simple. You know, better computer, more processing. But there are also a couple things that help your processing, like interface choice and, you know, certain choices about your computer as well. So obviously better graphics card, you're going to have, or graphics card or just processor in general. More cores equals more processing. So you want to get something that has over 4 now. This is kind of the standard. And at least 16 to 32 gigs. That's kind of a big thing, because without that, you're not going to be able to last for more than a couple years. And that's why I got the Mac Mini, just so I can add, I have 2 more slots for RAM, as well as the capability to hook on a GPU or eGPU and add a new graphics card and more core processing. So outside of that, yeah, 16 gigabytes is the new norm. It used to be 12, but now it's 16. And that's like, on my last setup running 16, it's like my computer can barely just handle, my MacBook can barely handle running like Twitch with all my like stream manager shit at the same time. So that's literally what it's being used for now. And nothing else is being run on it. And I'm about to wipe it so I can just make it like a straight up gaming computer. So that's just kind of like what you're going to be limited to if you have limits on your actual cores and your processor. So what do you do if you do have that limit? You're going to have to recognize when you're kind of hitting your limit. So that means once you've maxed out your buffer size and pretty much can't delay compensate anymore. So in options, you have delay compensation, and that will offset any latency, or however it offsets the processing in time. So when your buffer starts to die and starts to get over cached, or just, just be overfilled pretty much, everything will kind of break down, everything will stop, because now the delay compensation is really just too much, especially if you're using isotope plugins. So what I do to combat that is I freeze all the time and I move stuff. So that is how I have been making music on my MacBook with 16 gigabytes of RAM up until about a month ago. So, you gotta be able to compensate for that and move forward when you hit, roadblocks. So computer optimization will be the thing that kind of holds you back from doing, 50 tracks with like live processing or live synths potentially. So that's definitely something to keep in mind if you are on a MacBook and you are kind of locked. And this is really just MacBook. You can get an eGPU and try to, extend its life. So Apple has this kind of like Thunderbolt based eGPU that allows you to go and put new graphics cards into your computer, as well as more processing power. It's about $700 for it though. And then you have to go and get the other processors. So, it's about a $1,500 investment as opposed to a $3,000 investment if you're trying to get a new Mac laptop, which I highly, do not recommend at this point. Okay, so that's kind of like the last big thing I wanted to talk about here. Talked about, how to perceive sound in a real space, how that's going to affect phase. I did touch on music theory just to talk about how that's going to affect phase and perception of audio here. Final point I wanted to talk about, that was proximity effect. This is going to be something that affects how you, it could be mixing, or it can even be sound design, so proximity effect. Can anybody tell me what that is in the chat? Just wild guess. What is proximity effect? I mean, besides looking at it, like, what does that really mean? What am I talking about? So I'm just saying, like, give me a real world example of proximity effect. Okay. Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of like right answers. Okay, so it's exactly that. It's everybody who's saying like it's your closeness to something. It's how, something with distance Doppler effects, how far away something sounds, being close to a sound physically, I got nothing, bro. Panning. But yeah, no, so that's exactly it. So when something drives by you, you hear a bunch of things change, which is, pitch, reverb, panning, and volume. So this is just an introduction here. We're not going to be utilizing this in a crazy way here yet. But what that means is like pitch change. Like if I can bring up a YouTube thing right now. YouTube. My YouTube feed is interesting today. Never allow. All right, so when that car drives by and you can hear it go, its engine is not going, just like, acknowledging you there, like, hi, like some kind of weird car whale. Sick, bro. The car flipped. All right, that's enough of that. So what it's doing is it's actually, sound is bending, right? So it's being generated from its source. But because it's changing its distance to you, you're hearing different size of wavelength of the actual sound being created. And so its pitch is actually changing to your perception only. So your brain is perceiving it bend around you. And what happens is you have a bunch of things that come into effect is panning left and right, because you have two ears. You hear it pass from left to right based on how you are looking at it. And then it gets louder, quieter, and then adds the world around it to it as well. Like if it's in a city, it's going to sound, kind of like echoey and cavernous, but also have, a lot of bustle to it or whatever. But if it's like somebody setting a land speed record or something like that, it's just going to be a really quick, and then maybe a sonic boom. That's the kind of thing that might happen after, where sound has to catch up with itself, with the source, and then it hits you all at once, or hits the atmosphere all at once, because sound is being moved so quickly that it literally ripples the atmosphere itself. And so it creates that sonic boom, and you hear it just crack. Shit's crazy dope. So that's going to affect how you pan stuff, how you put reverb on things, how you go and take things out of the mix to hear it more up front. Because what does up front mean? It sounds really close to me. What does all the way in the back mean? It sounds far away. So we need to understand how proximity effect affects our mixing, but also how that can be used as a sound design tool. Because Waves has a plugin called Doppler that literally does it for you, just for sound design stuff, and it's really cool. All right, so that's that. We're going to be going more into that with like audio fundamental stuff, and through the whole process of learning all this stuff and how we can utilize it, especially in the spatial effects stuff. But for EQ and compression, we will be diving into these individually, because I just want to focus on how each works, and you can go and continue to use the compressors and EQs however you want, even after you know how to use them. And that's what's great about them, is you can use these however you want in sound design. But with mixing, it's a little bit more specific, And so having a good foundation in theory is huge. So what I recommended in here only for you guys to read is compression and equalization techniques for now. When we get into hardcore mixing, we're going to go kind of deeper into theory stuff and how that really comes into play, because that is something that is not really so much of a problem in electronic music, just because you're using samples and everything sounds perfect. In the real world, things don't sound the same every time. That is just impossible. All right, so EQs. EQs. We know what an EQ is. EQs are simple. They're filters. What's a graphic EQ? It's a filter with many bands, and these bands are peak filters, and they allow you to, change the Q and get different resolutions, Yeah, so everybody's points about what you're saying about reverb and how all that stuff happens. That is really, really a cool thing. Like say if you're watching like something like Star Wars or anything like that. just to actually allude to Yoda for you saying that. Um, yeah, like seeing like a bullet hit something and like hearing that have impact, making that have impact. It doesn't have impact unless you do the things that make proximity effect happen. Because when you're a sound designer making a fake world come to life, you have to trick the brain in order to make those fake things come to life, because it has to look like it's actually happening on screen. So you have to make sure that you have some type of proximity effect leading up to a bullet hitting the surface, or a bunch of bullets hitting the surface, or traveling, at slowed down speed like the Matrix or something like that, So there's a lot of things that go into that. Okay, just to get back on track here, just because my my chat is a little bit slow on this. All right, so we talked about what phase means and how that works already. So this is definitely a huge thing in EQs, because not only is the sound being filtered, we know that. Filtered how many times? 8 times if it's EQ 8. But it's also EQing left and right channel. So left and right channel means that I can do a couple things with it. That being, whoops. Create a left and right channel EQ. I can focus on different channels and potentially do mid-side. And we're going to talk about mid-side, and there's a bunch of resources, and I think Noisia actually has a good video on mid-side as well. But it's really interesting, and it's a way to make mono sounds sound bigger by EQing things out of the mid and the side, by creating phase discrepancies between these two channels. So it flips the phase of the side channel, eliminating the frequencies from the middle. So the mid allows you to EQ this phased out mid perspective, while side allows you to EQ the phased out side perspective. So you can do like things like that with any EQ that allows you to control left and right channels. Like say, keep on doing that. Let's go Pro Q, Pro Q3, Pro Q3 the homie. So we can do mid-side on pretty much any of the bands, stereo placement, mid or side, left, right. Stereo means that left and right channel are linked, and that's kind of how you want your EQ to work. So stereo, one channel, one EQ to rule them all, but that's actually 2 EQs that are being ruled at the same time. So why does that affect phase? Because if the processing in the DSP of the actual EQ that's digital is not perfect, then it will have phase discrepancies left and right. So zero latency is the standard now. Natural phase is how it used to be. So natural phase, you can do that, and you can kind of color left and right. When you start to add more gain, you create more phase discrepancies between left and right channel. That's something to know about like how EQs work. Linear phase, what's that mean? That means it's like a mastering grade EQ. Just to talk about LSV's point here, if it's mono, wouldn't there be no side? So to that point again, mid-side is meant for mono sounds specifically. And it's meant to expand the kind of perception of mono sounds in general. So it literally makes a copy of the original sound and flips the phase of that sound in order to create a side channel. But the mid and side channel are the original source. So you can do that with anything stereo channels. It just sums it together and then creates those 2 mono channels again. So, you know, there's arguments on like whether or not that should be used as a mastering tool, because a lot of mastering engineers don't like that, because they're like, phase in my master? And when you go to like a live setting for like DJs and stuff, that can be actually really cool if you're limited to a lot of mono environments for like your kicker snare or something like that. So that's something that's really cool with it. Just to talk about linear phase really quick though, it's really simple to understand. And let's see if we can get this help tip. Okay, so this should explain all the linear phase kind of like EQs. And what I was saying, it's a mastering level EQ, so it's actually taking a buffer. So buffer means latency. It's taking a snapshot and pushing the entire timeline of your track now to compensate with the amount of processing going on here. So more processing, more latency. So how can we see that in Ableton? So I just set it to maximum. So maximum should not be used on an individual channel. That's illegal. And when I highlight on the top, it tells me my latency in the bottom left, and you can see that 66,000 samples. That means a 1.5 seconds of latency. Low gives me 3,000. Still a lot, 69.7 milliseconds. And zero latency, 0. Happening right now. So in EQ8, I have oversampling set on. And that's on my default. So I always have kind of like their linear phase EQ on. But it's the most minor linear phase EQ ever, because it's only 16 samples. Natural phase, I believe, has more latency than that on ProQ. Any plugin you use in Ableton, you can see the latency in the bottom left-hand corner just like that. So EQ8 actually does not create phasing. Auto filter does. So like I said about linear phase, it's a mastering EQ. So it's not meant for individual channels, just like Isotope. And they take a generous helping. They're not saying like this EQ needs that much. They're gonna say this EQ needs that much for this, or for any of these other settings here. Maximum or very high is like, how far can we push this to get the maximum fidelity? You know, that sets them apart from waves, you know. And FabFilter is really good. So they are mastering level plugins. Hence why I'm like introducing them, because they can be used in the mixing process, sound design process, and in mastering. And when I master and use a mastering EQ, I usually use Pro Q3, unless I use a dynamic EQ. And we're gonna learn about what dynamic EQs do. I'm sure a lot of you know what I'm talking about, but don't really know what they do. So dynamic EQ works kind of like a multi-band, but now this band has a threshold and will only subtract any information when that threshold is crossed. So it's like a compressor and an EQ all in one. Okay, so Mary, to your point, what's the difference between natural and linear? Linear phase is meant for mastering. What does linear mean? It means straight line. That means grab them and enforce that line. Enforce the zero crossing. Always create the zero crossing at this point for left and right channel. And we'll give you this much time to get your shit together to make that happen. Do it, EQ. You have 1.5 seconds. So in other plugins, say like this dynamic EQ has 0 latency. And that is because it's supposed to be like a mixing tool, you know? But if I load on a maximizer, It's probably going to be a lot more. So 721 samples at the lowest setting. So any limiter is meant for mastering chain. We go into like Fab Filter, again, Pro L and Pro L2. Actually, I don't think I have the Pro L2. I do have Pro L2 though. It's not showing up. I think I have a VST3 version. Whoops, Pro L3. I'm in the future. Alright, so that has 2,000 samples by default. And you can multiply that. So times 16, or times 32, is times 32 of, you know, the original sample amount. But, you know, it's not too crazy. So we're going to talk about how limiters work and all that as well, just to kind of make a point about latency and how that affects EQs and stuff. So the big difference with natural is that natural phase is trying to emulate how, say, a vintage analog EQ works. Because if an analog EQ is to process left and right channel, it has to have two identical signal flows with the same exact type of processing on both channels. I'm going to type in API. API, I like API. So they have stereo and mono versions of this, but the graphic EQs are linked on left and right channel if it's a stereo plugin. So that creates fixed bandwidth, and then also creates saturation to kind of fill that phase gap, and then, you know, give that band the ability to change amplitude. So in almost all analog circuits, there's some type of tube powering that circuit to amplify it, or there's some type of solid state type of saturation gain stage. Gain staging means pushing the gain into the next stage. So next stage would be out. Out, send that signal out, and here's some gain for the road. The signal can have a little gain. So left and right channel will do that. Say on an SSL EQ also does that. You can change the bands on this, but it will color it, and the coloration creates phase discrepancies. But again, they have saturation curves creating new harmonics. So the more you push an analog EQ's filter gain, the more you're going to create these extra harmonics. Natural phase in Pro Q3 kind of emulates the phase things that happen, not so much the saturation, because it's not trying to emulate any direct thing. It's a digital graphic EQ. Able to make as many bands really as I want. Might be a limit around 32 or something like that. But also have something key locked. That's really cool. So now when we're trying to mix and key, we have a tool that locks our EQ's frequency to the perfect note. Yes, to marry, it adds character. So it adds coloration. So coloration, character, more harmonics, saturates. So that's a cool thing about that. The channel strips also do that as well. And they have built-in filters as well, which are just low-pass filters and high-pass filters, just like you would find on like a mic or something. So all that should be interesting because it adds saturation to the actual sound. It's not just turning up or down a band anymore. And so what's really cool about these EQs that are digital though, is that you can change the Q really, really wide or really, really sharp. So because these are filters and they're trying to emulate these kind of like analog things, I will self-resonate if I go and push this Q this high. What does that mean? Self-resonation means that it'll generate a new tone at the frequency, pretty much a sine wave, to the exact point of like, what is a ladder filter? You know, has an oscillator powering that band. Really good analog EQs, if they have 8 bands, then they have 8 oscillators powering those bands and holding its frequency range that's limited, locked to this range for phase. So you can call it a high mid band or a mid band or a low band. You know, so they try to eliminate phase problems at every stage, and that's, you know, really it's, you know, the character of that actual EQ in an analog setting is how it handles that, how it changes those bands to compensate for that phase, how clean is that phase, and then also what type of saturation is in there. You know, so classically Neve is a very good option, and that's like a UAD plugin or something like that. API is a really good option for that if you're looking for like softer, warmer character. And then SSL gives you a little bit more high frequency, and that's just due to their types of saturation curves. Yeah, and all the Brainworks stuff too. Brainworks is super cool. And SPL. Believe I have a bunch of those. So SPL has all of these types of plugins that are like a passive EQ. Oops, this one's not activated, but kind of the same thing. But you see how there are 2 outputs, left and right? That means it's stereo. So on a stereo EQ, you see the exact same settings on 2 channels, allowing you to EQ 2 mono signals or 1 stereo signal. So we're going to see that pretty much in everything that's analog, regardless of whether or not it's compression, spatial effect, saturation. This is outside of that. This is more of an introduction into how to implement that processing, how to make it cool. So, you know, that's kind of the basic stuff I wanted to talk about today with EQs. Just to introduce a lot of those things. We're going to really be diving into what this is good for. And I'm going to be giving out a lot of frequency range charts to give you kind of a guideline of how to EQ things. And say if you want feedback from me, I'm going to tell you certain things about the quality of your timbres and stuff. And, you know, if you want to know exactly what that means, you know, it'll be kind of based on that. Just because I do tend to call stuff by those names, where it's like too much low mids, muddy, too much mids, which is like 500 to 1K. It sounds boxy. It's too shrill. Now that range is 1.5 to 4K, leaning to 3.2 kilohertz. And then I say it's too sibilant. You know, that's 7K up to 12K. You know, so it's like all those qualities. Like if you want to be a professional in the mixing kind of world, that's like what a professional engineer would tell you to do. Say if you're driving for them, it's like, I need more air. Can you give me more air to this? And it's like, yeah, sure, I'll give you more air. And then you pull out the fire extinguisher, and then you hit them. No, I'm just kidding. You boost 12K with a shelf filter. So air is that stuff above 12K. So when you're recording stuff at a high quality, you're able to get that type of like, you know, breath and air quality, which gives it a little bit more intimacy, especially if you're doing kind of like ASMR style vocalists like Billie Eilish or something, or FKA Twigs. And I call them ASMR style vocalists because that's what it is. They're just whispering to a mic and just making everyone feel weird. Feel some type of way, yo. All right, so Now compression. Let's introduce compression. So, this is kind of like our course outline for like the next 4 or 5 weeks. But also, it's going to kind of be split into like a couple days towards the end where we cover, all 4 of these in their own day. But then, a few weeks just on this and tying all of this into this. So, what does compression mean? Compression means this. Reduce the dynamic range. That's it. That's compression. Summed it up to 3 words. So if you're confused still, what does that mean? Reduce the dynamic range. One of my mentors gave a really good example once. And he said, say if you're driving with your grandma in the car and you put on some rock music that's loud. Your compressor is how fast it takes for your grandma to turn down that music. So your grandma's the compressor, you're the audio, and then she turns it down. So grandma's attack is around 10 milliseconds, real fast. And her release, she doesn't let go of that gain knob for like 1 to 2 seconds. So she's holding on to it. She's slapping your hand away. If she's slapping your hand away, then she's a limiter. So grandma up on that stereo. She is the aux. You are not the aux. You do not take the aux from grandma. So grandma is the compressor. She is the dynamic range. She says reduce. So a compressor is how fast the dynamic range will be reduced. So we're going to be kind of like stepping into what each component means. What is ratio? What is that number doing? How does attack and release affect your ratio? And how does threshold change that too? The different types of compression too. Because there's not just one type of compression, and there also is not one way to use a compressor or an EQ. It's all fine-tuned to taste. If you're to say you can only paint with a brush, then you would have an army of anima artists dumping paint up their ass to shoot it at you. Just an army. Full-on army. They're just like, nope, I can use different things to paint. So you can do anything with this. And what's the analogy to that in using compressor? That's 10 OTTs, bro. Throw in 10 OTTs, that shit's crazy loud. And that shit sounds doper. Sounds dopeness doper. So, yeah, like, what happens when you throw on 10 OTTs though? You're creating saturation. Because when you're limiting the dynamic range and you're controlling the dynamic range, saturation and wave shaping is compression too. So is running things through tube and tape. So now you start to limit its dynamic range at like the resolution level. You kind of create square waves by distorting your compressors so much. Now you're creating more high end where there wasn't any because you're destroying the fuck out of it and squishing the shit out of it. So there's like a ton of things to like keep in mind when you're kind of like dialing in your compressor, when to kind of just keep going, and also, how to actually use it well. Not just dumping EQ and compression on things just because you think that's what it needs. And also compression before EQ. What's that all about? Do I compress before I EQ? Do I EQ before I compress and EQ after and then compress again? That really doesn't matter. All that doesn't matter. It's about how does your dynamic range affect your compressor. Say if your low end was too loud and it's making your compressor pump and distort, and you want to wrangle it in. Maybe an EQ would be the thing to go and turn down the low end before it hits your compressor, because again, summing, all of it's got to hit one output. So if, back to the Fletcher-Munson curve, you know, your low end is hitting your output first, you know, and it's super loud, then your compressor is going to limit based on this lower frequency and then pump all this shit down. And you're going to lose resolution and fidelity and all your transients, and you're just going to lose, you know, all of your clarity in your track, you know. So it's like how to get it loud, you know, how to get your shit really loud. This is the way, you know. You got to understand how to compress stuff at every level, and then combine that with EQ. It's not subtractive EQ equals moody good. It's subtractive EQ plus compression, the whole entire process, to the point where he's got everything, maybe even in audio, resampled, and then he's going and throwing that again into a timeline, and then chopping that up, and then processing that again, and then maybe bounces into stems, mixes it again, and then processes it again, and then he throws those stems into a master. You know, maybe masters out of stems. So stem mastering is different from stem mixing, because when you stem mix, you're prepping for your master to level everything. But when you stem master, you create one final master print from stems. And so you're able to control each of the little pieces, meaning bass, kick, top synths, 5. That's the limit. 5 pieces, no more than that. If you have 5 more pieces, or 5, more than 5, I guess, on your stem master, you are stem mixing now. You are not mastering out of that. You want to sum it into final buses. Then you can even edit that shit. You can even cut it up and make it cleaner. So you've finished your entire track, you process the shit out of it, and now you have it summed up to 5 pieces. And now you can go and edit that again and make it cleaner and process it again and then master from that. That's how I do a lot of my tracks. Things I want to drop tomorrow, I just straight up drop a limiter on and throw to SoundCloud. But things I want to be on my album, I do that. I do all this in my mixing as well. So that's really crucial to know, you know. So again, what does compression mean? Reduce the dynamic range. How fast that signal will be turned down. That's the easiest way to understand compression. If you're trying to, you know, over-complexify it, just come back to this. How fast something is being compressed. So there are ways to compress things, and there are ways to destroy things with compression. Most people know how to destroy, because destroying things with a compressor is really easy. All you got to do is crank everything up. Just throw it up to 11, man. Higher numbers equals better, louder, better, gooder. The biggest number equals the biggest me. So I do big numbers. But no. So it's really just like, if you want to go and do shit that sounds crazy, you can just go and throw shit at the wall and, you know, find that actual sound. To your point, Stosu, that is exactly what I'm talking about here with mixing. So with attack and release, there's a way to sculpt a transient. There's not one way to compress, but there is one way to hyper compress and to sculpt and transient design. How does the makeup knob in Ableton compressor affect this? That's a good question, because makeup gain, you know, what's that do? So when you reduce the dynamic range, that's called gain reduction, GR. So when you see a gain reduction meter say 5 dB, that means 5 dB are being taken away from the final dynamic range. So then if you want to get that back, so now you're reducing the peak level and pushing up the RMS level, which is average. So now it's going to be louder for longer. You can give the signal back 5 dB. push the output by 5 dB. So makeup gain means make up the signal that was lost. So give it back what you took from it. So compression versus expansion, what's that mean? OTT. This is OTT right here. OTT, or the multiband in live, is a compressor expander. You know, so if you're gonna really understand what both of these do, even how this compressor works in general, what's this mean? What's that mean? How do I do this? Why does it do that? Why is it that color? You know, blue means expansion. So expansion is upwards compression. Compression, the way you know it, is called downwards compression. And that's the professional way to call it. Like if you were going to go and create a compressor, you would have to prove to these people who are engineers what type of compression you do. Upwards compression or downwards compression? Upwards expansion or downwards compression? Downward expansion, I would say. So there's many ways to compress a signal. This does all of them, and it does them in multiple bands. So it's like the OTT from Xfer actually, but now you have all this control. How fast each band reduces signal. This also tells this band how fast to bring the signal up to the threshold. So two different types of compression: upwards compression and downwards compression. Upwards expansion and downwards expansion. How would I implement expansion? When I don't have enough highs in my bass. Say with like this. So if I had like one of my subs that I usually like to drop in, and I'll just drop a multi just to kind of start from zero. Change my crossovers to kind of really hit the bands that I'm playing. So I can expand the low end here. So it just holds it at that level. Or I can tell it to go louder and it distorts. Now I can tell my high end to compress more, compress faster. Two very different sounds, literally just in the compressor though. I'm juicing the stuff out of it. That's how I see expansion in terms of sound design, is juicing out what's already there, getting the best representation of the good stuff. So I'm not making anything new here. I'm just bringing it up so I can hear it. And that's really what dynamic range is all about. How to reduce that dynamic range. I want it to be louder and have less changes between the loudest peak and the lowest peak. So LUFS is talking about the same exact thing. So when you're trying to get LUFS up to that point, you need to expand your entire mix so it doesn't have that discrepancy between it. And I'm going to go really deep into like drum compression specifically, because hyper compression is built around that. Right. So when we go into OTT and multiband, we're going to really cover that. And then we're also going to cover isotope and Pro MB. Pro MB is really cool. Probably one of the strongest ones. All right. So that's going to be like next week, week after, and the week after that. So I'm sure like just me talking about this now is going to like inspire you, hopefully, to go and start to just fuck around with stuff, you know? Really just, you know, you should always at all points not be limited by the amount of knowledge you have. That if you are making that cop out, then you are limiting your potential. And this is stuff I tell myself. No, it's not something I'm just preaching. It's like when I look in the mirror, it's like, hey, what the fuck are you doing? Wake up. All right, so spatial effects. We talked about this with, all of the stuff I've been showing you in sound design. But I really want to give this to processing too, because I want to go deep into these delays. And I also want to keep synthesis for synthesis. So I don't want to go too deep into like a grain delay for like an hour when we could be going into all of absinthe. So that's kind of the trade-off I'm doing here. So we're going to be going into this just so we can cover them specifically. So I'm sure you guys kind of understand what a chorus is, and a flanger. So, these are actually delays, and they're used to blur and widen sounds, not just vocals and leads. It means anything. So you can put that on the mid-range band of a respace that you're sine compressing. So that's kind of like the overall kind of like idea is you can spread it out, modulate that delay's time value. That is what a chorus is. A flanger kind of does the same thing, but now it's modulating the pitch. So a flanger modulates the pitch of each delayed signal, while chorus modulates the time. Both kind of do the same thing. Because when you change time in a tape delay, it changes pitch too. But, they both have very different effects. Flanging can be really similar to frequency shifting or phasing, So flanging actually is like more of a micro amount, whereas chorusing can be like 20 milliseconds and above. So flanging is really 20 milliseconds and below to the more comb filtering side of delays. So imaging, just to tie this in, same exact thing, widening the sound, but now there's no modulator. We have to look at an imager in here. This spreads out each band. I can learn the noise curve of the incoming signal, so I can find where those bands should be. And then I can expand or make them mono. Like if I want to make the sub mono, but I want to expand the mid to highs. Now I have to turn on stereoize, and it gives me a millisecond value. And this locks that kind of like chorusing amount, delay amount it's doing per channel. I can spread that out, move that around. So you can see how that kind of dials in. So when I'm looking at it, I just want it to be up the middle. If I want that to be kind of like wide in the highs, then I can do that. And I do this a lot when I'm sound designing, even while printing, just so I don't have to like do it later and I can actually have the ultimate sound. It's really cool if you use an imager before a saturator, because now you're saturating left and right channel a little bit different. It creates movement. Same thing with the chorus or any kind of delay signal. So again, signal flow. When to put your processing at different points in the chain. And then finally, reverb. And I just actually talked about this with tape delays and stuff. But this is going to be another thing we talk about with like Ubermod and other types of tape delays like H delay. But reverb, that's really cool. Reverb is interesting because it is a delay as well, but the delay is called a diffusion network. And that diffusion network is calculated either off of an impulse response from a convolution, or it's calculated off of a typical curve from a certain type of metal, from like a plate, gold, silver, iron, whatever you want. Or, the type of reflections inside of a hall or chamber or, anything like that. So With a plate, it's going to be a little bit harsher because it's metal. In a hall, it's going to be a little bit softer because it's a hall. It has stuff in it. It has cement walls and stuff like that. It's very reflective, but it's a little bit darker. So those all have characteristics to them. All the reverbs also have characteristics to them. There's real versions of all of it as well. So that's really cool. Coolest one though is impulse responses and how to calculate that per per impulse response. You can go inside of like any surface really with a mic, like click, or they say fire off a blank inside of like a church, which most people won't let you do. Hey, can I borrow your church? For what? So I can fire a gun in it? No. But it's for science. Yeah. It doesn't really go over well. So don't really ask people for that. But you could probably go in there and just sneak in the back when nobody's there, and then just like have your friend with like a Zoom recorder and then just go up to the pew and just clap really loud. That's a good one. And then if like the pastor comes out, it's like, hey, you kids, I told you no taking impulse responses in here. And then you just run away and you're just like, I got you. Most pastors are not mixing engineers, so they don't know what you're doing. They just think you're just having fun, dude. Just clapping for Jesus, exactly. Clap once. All right. So final big processing thing I want to talk about. And this is going to be just for 101. We're going to go deeper into other stuff, meaning spectral effects and things like that. Just for weird stuff and for really cool stuff. I'm trying to get the Melda DSP stuff in here as well. And that's like, along with Max for Live and doing stuff with VC Rack and all that kind of shit. So there's a ton of depth to this. This is just like, so you can go and learn this and then go and step into like the mixing class and then mix your tracks and master your shit and sound good, because that's really the ultimate goal. And I'm not trying to limit y'all. I want y'all to kind of be lifted up by this at the expense of me, for sure. All right, so we've talked about saturation like the whole time, like how to get saturation and stuff like that, what the noise floor is and how to limit that using bit depth. Nice, good one. Yeah, so this is something we're going to go really deep on trash about. And also Saturn. So trash. We're going to be like really understanding how this entire interface works and why it's cool. And, to every point I just made about this. Trash is a processing suite because it does all the processing things. It does all that, including this, because you can automate it. No, but also it has modulation built into it, kind of like, a synth. And you can also trigger certain things in it with like envelope followers. I don't believe it has a MIDI input, but let's check. Nope, no MIDI input. But I think Neutron might, and Alloy 2. Alloy 2 definitely doesn't. Neutron might, just because it has actually, if it has a transient designer. Nope, doesn't have one. It's more of a Neutron thing. But transient designers can definitely be triggered by that. But all these suites will have some type of saturator. Allow you to go multi-band as well. So you can saturate multiple bands. Neutron's pretty cool. I like Alloy 2 a lot though, just because I've been using it a lot for a lot of stuff, and just some really cool stuff. So again though, inside of trash, the entire suite is in there. So you can EQ, you can saturate, EQ, change with reverb, compress, and then delay. So 2 types of spatial effects, as well as 2 EQs, and 1 dynamics, which can be multiband too, up to 4 bands, as well as a multiband saturator with 2 stages per band. So 2 levels of wave shaping per band. Both in line, routed series, and then another EQ built into it. So, ton of shit. But what does this do? What does all that do? What does that mean? How do I go and like do stuff methodically, you know, and just with an actual intention, not just make it sound shitty and destroyed. So we're gonna talk about all that. I'm not gonna run that because that's gonna be harsh. But yeah, there's a ton of stuff that goes into this. You know, one little thing we've already talked about, DC filter. That's your direct current offset. So that's phase. So that's saying the phase of an incoming signal will be locked together after running through this saturator. So that means you can do the same thing with Ableton saturator, Bableton. And I use the Ableton saturator on my masters set to medium curve because it limits the dynamic range while giving it a nice little curve. That curve right there is everything, because that separates distortion from actual clarity. So raises the noise floor while not clipping. So if I drive it harder into that, then it will clip. I can turn on soft clipper for that. I can do anything I want with that. I can even use the soft clipper in glute compression. And if I didn't make that clear, when we were talking about, you know, how a compressor works, that includes glue compression, you know. If you're thinking like that this might not be part of it, it is. You know, it's how to use all this stuff, as well as how to sidechain and really dial that stuff in. But saturation is probably one of the biggest things because it's harmonic excitement, generating second order harmonics, new harmonics that weren't there, but were created from the source material. So it's all part of the same network of understanding. It's all interlocked, man. People. So all this stuff's super cool. You know, it's going to be a deep, deep ride. It's not going to be any point where you're not going to be kind of like, you know, getting something new, because this is stuff that I think about every day whenever I produce. Not to like rehash everything I've ever learned, you know, but it's just part of my process, you know. It's like literally it aids me in every step of the process and shit. So final point to talk about is the automation. What is this? What am I talking about? Snapshot automation. What that? So automation, we're gonna go into this when we do like more implementation stuff with sound design and sampling and stuff. And for next week's synth class, it's going to be mostly phase plant and serum. So get ready for that. We're going to go and finish the wavetable editor and the oscillator effects and how to properly resample into serum and use phase plant. So that's a big day. But yeah, creative techniques for automation, when to automate things, when to take things out. As an engineer, not as an artist. This is now as an engineer. Someone has paid you, an artist has paid you to engineer their track. What decisions do you make? All the things. Is it good or is it not? Oh, yeah. So there's a lot of shit to that. But like, you know, there's a lot of techniques I've learned from just like learning on consoles and like just from all the different places I've been with it, just like jumping from studio to studio. Yeah, and like a lot of the different engineers have a lot of different mentalities about things. The most open people I've met were probably at Trilogy Studios and Fantasy Studios. Trilogy, I actually got the pleasure to kind of like help out setting up sessions for people, and like that was cool, just seeing how they kind of like set up how they're gonna go and capture this shit and then play it back and then put it inside the console and make it happen. you know. So automation, huge roadblock in mixing on a console. So snapshot automation is that version on a console where you can say turn on a whole set of EQs just for the chorus. And that's to EQ the same source material. So that's why I'm making this point here. You don't have the luxury of mixing 20 tracks for each vocal take. So if you were mixing in Pro Tools, you would send all those 20 vocal takes to one bus. And then you would send that through an EQ chain in post-processing or outboard gear. But that would ultimately be summed up to one track. So ultimately, you're going to have to like work around stuff if you do like live shit like that. But it also, you know, created a style, you know, just because of that. So a lot of choruses will expand things. You know, they'll actually pan things to the left and right, add more channels, or say like on a build-up, and I gave this example here, you know, you put in a utility on your master and you automate it to mono right before the drop. Yes, 100%, Stosu. If I could, I would print all my stuff to tape. Like, Jimmy Edgar, my hero. Jimmy Edgar, my hero, Lord and Savior. And, Richard Devine, the one true sound designer. So yeah, that's definitely a medium I would prefer. Just because it's so rich, you know, and adds a ton of low end to stuff. Also, every top 40 producer also does that. I've given this example to a lot of people that I know, but just to like compare SSLs to Neve consoles, and like at a studio I worked at, I gave like this big walkthrough. And, you know, had to be like the liaison for this guy. But he was the main product designer for like SSL and, you know, sells, you know, $500,000 consoles to people around the world and shit. So he was just like, oh, where's the beer? So we just went out for drinks and shit. And then he was just talking shit about SSL the whole time. And I'm here to tell you about it in public. And so what he was saying was that most people don't, you know, actually invest so much into buying a console nowadays. What they do is they rent them for a couple weeks and run all their electronic stuff through it just to get that analog saturation. So, you know, he said they used to get a bunch of hip hop artists, but now, since like Neve is kind of more suited for that, and a lot of people found that out through like listening to Swiss Beats and Dr. Dre and Ice Cube. So Ice Cube is another person who, when he produces, he rents out a Neve console and runs all that stuff through that. Same thing with like Lil Wayne, probably Kanye as well. It just really doesn't make sense to own all that stuff unless you have, you know, $1 million to invest into just one part of your house or something just for that. You know, a lot of people don't do that because it is a $500,000 investment and upkeep. So it's a lot of stuff. A lot of studios right now are being put out of business because they have a mixing console. A lot of places in the Midwest are having that happen, but because the Midwest is so, I guess, driven by the country scene, and there's a ton of like live recording and band stuff and all that stuff still, it's actually not as big of a problem there. But in California, everything in the Bay is almost taken a dive, including like Fantasy Studios, which was the place where Miles Davis recorded all his albums, Coltrane, just ton of stuff, dude, and it's all dead. Yeah, really sad stuff, but you know, it's the nature of digital technology in general. It's like if you can't pivot and use both analog and digital things, you will not survive. And to that point too, when I was in